Please, I'll do anything, the father whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the busy pharmacy. His eyes, red and tired, stared at the small bottle in his hand, the life-saving medicine his child desperately needed, but he knew he didn't have enough to pay for it. His fingers trembled, clutching the bottle like it was the only thing that could save his son. The child's fever had only worsened over the past few days, and the hospital bills had already drained what little savings they had. There was no more room for the unexpected. The father had already skipped meals, sold off small possessions, and now, standing in front of the cashier, he had one last hope. If you want to know what happens next in this heart-wrenching journey, and how a simple act of kindness can change everything, subscribe to see the rest of this unforgettable story. His heart raced as the cashier scanned the barcode, the machine's beep too loud in his ears. The total flashed on the screen, and it felt like a weight had just been dropped on his chest. $200. His face fell. He had only brought 100. The cashier, a young woman in her early 20s, looked up from the screen, offering a polite yet detached smile. "Is that all, sir?" she asked. The father opened his wallet, counting the crumpled bills with shaking hands. $100. He tried to make the numbers add up in his head, but they didn't. There wasn't enough. I don't have enough, he stammered, feeling the familiar sting of helplessness creeping into his chest. His mind raced. He could sell his old tools, his phone, maybe even borrow from the neighbors again, but none of that would be enough. How long can my son last without this medicine? The cold air of the pharmacy seemed to close in around him. The walls, once a comfort, now felt like a cage. He looked at the medicine one last time, his fingers gripping it harder, as though it might change the reality he was facing. Is there any way? He trailed off, not sure what he was asking anymore. The cashier hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder to the manager, who seemed busy with another customer. No one can help me, the father thought bitterly. The silence stretched on, and the small shop's sterile fluorescent lights hummed as though they were mocking him. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything. I should have saved more. I should have prepared better. He didn't know how long he stood there before he heard a voice behind him, a calm yet firm tone that cut through his turmoil. I'll pay for it. The words seemed to slow everything around him, like the world had suddenly shifted gears. The father turned, startled, and found himself face to face with a man who looked familiar but out of place in this simple pharmacy. He wasn't dressed in any special way, but there was something about him that made everything else fade into the background. The man smiled gently. I can help, he said. The father blinked, confused. He thought the voice was a mirage, a fleeting echo in his own desperation. But no, the man's presence was real. Before the father could respond, the cashier looked up in surprise. Mr. Reeves? The name hit him like a wave, though he couldn't process it. Keanu Reeves? The father felt his heart skip a beat, but there was no time for disbelief. I'll pay, Keanu repeated, reaching for his wallet with the same calm demeanor he had when he first spoke. The father's head spun. Keanu Reeves? What is he doing here? But in that moment it didn't matter. There was still hope. Just for a second, there was someone who understood. Someone who wasn't judging him for being unable to provide. For a moment, the father allowed himself to breathe again. As Keanu handed over the money, he didn't expect anything in return, and just like that, the father's weight seemed to lift, if only slightly. The medicine, the precious medicine, was finally within reach. But this was more than just an exchange of money. It was a moment of compassion that would change everything. The father stood there, his eyes still locked on Keanu as the cashier processed the payment. He felt like he was dreaming. There in front of him was someone who didn't just see his desperation but understood it. Yet, as Keanu handed over the money, the father couldn't help but feel a surge of shame, like he didn't deserve such kindness. He blinked, trying to focus. His child was still sick at home, lying in bed, barely able to lift their head. He could already imagine the pain in his child's eyes if he couldn't bring back the medicine. He had promised them he would, and now this stranger, Keanu Reeves no less, had given him a lifeline. but something gnawed at him. Why me? Why would Keanu Reeves be in a place like this? The father's head was spinning with questions. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but before he could, the cashier spoke again, her voice shaky. Do you know who that was? She asked in disbelief, staring after Keanu as he walked out of the pharmacy. The father's heart thudded in his chest. He nodded slowly, though he still wasn't entirely sure he had processed what just happened. Yes, I think I know. But why would he? His voice faltered. He couldn't finish the sentence. It didn't make sense. The cashier seemed to gather her thoughts, glancing at the father with wide eyes. I can't believe it, she said softly. Keanu Reeves paid for your medicine. The words seemed to echo in the father's mind. It was like something in his life had just shifted. He had been so desperate, so certain that the walls were closing in on him. Now they were opening, but in a way he didn't fully understand. I don't know how to thank him, the father muttered, his voice breaking as the weight of the situation came crashing down on him. His knees felt weak. I never expected this. I never thought someone like him would ever. The cashier took a step closer, still processing the encounter herself. Do you know what this means? She asked quietly, her tone filled with awe. Keanu Reeves didn't just pay for your medicine. He saw you. He saw what you were going through. Most people would have walked away, but he didn't. The father's mind wandered back to the moment when Keanu had stepped in. He had been so wrapped up in his own sorrow, in the crushing weight of his responsibilities, that he hadn't noticed the strange presence behind him until Keanu spoke. He remembered the calm, almost serene expression on Keanu's face, as if he understood exactly what the father was feeling. There was no judgment, no hesitation, just quiet kindness. But why would Keanu Reeves care about someone like him? The cashier broke his thoughts. I mean, think about it. He's one of the most famous people in the world, but there he was standing right next to you, right in front of you. It's almost like he knew exactly what you needed. The father's heart raced again, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Did Keanu know? He glanced at the cashier. Do you think he meant for me to feel this way? The cashier, who had witnessed the entire exchange, seemed to contemplate his question. I don't know, she admitted, but I think maybe he didn't just give you money, he gave you something more. Maybe it was a reminder that there's still good in the world, that people care, even when you think no one does. Her words lingered in the air, a quiet truth that resonated deep within him. But still, why had Keanu done it? There had to be a reason, right? The father's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the pharmacy door opening. He turned instinctively, his gaze falling on the man who had been his unexpected savior. Keanu Reeves stepped back into the store, his face still calm and gentle, but this time there was something more, something unspoken that the father couldn't quite put his finger on. It was like Keanu wasn't just here to help him with his immediate need, but with something deeper, something the father hadn't fully understood yet. The cashier straightened up, her eyes wide. She was about to speak, but the father raised a hand, signaling her to hold on. This was not a moment for words, it was a moment for understanding. Understanding what? Keanu approached the counter, his footsteps steady and deliberate. I think you're forgetting something, he said softly, his voice smooth and comforting. The father could feel the intensity of his words, though Keanu had spoken them as casually as if discussing the weather. The father stood still, unsure of what to say. Keanu's presence, like an anchor in the chaos, kept his thoughts grounded, but still, why was he here again? Why had Keanu come back? I didn't expect... The father trailed off, his voice cracking under the weight of the emotions he had been suppressing all day. Keanu smiled, though it wasn't the typical grin the father had seen in the movies. It wasn't a performance or an act for the camera. It was a real smile, an understanding smile. You didn't expect someone to help? Keanu asked, almost as if he already knew the answer. The father blinked, taken aback by the simple question. He hadn't realized he was asking for help at all, not in those terms. He had just been trying to survive. But Keanu, with that soft, knowing look in his eyes, made it feel like something else. Most people wouldn't have, the father admitted, lowering his gaze. They wouldn't even have noticed. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't feel like a celebrity at that moment. He just felt like someone who genuinely cared. "I noticed," he said, "and I wanted to help." The father felt a lump form in his throat. There it was again, the same quiet compassion Keanu had shown earlier. But what was different this time was that Keanu wasn't just giving the father something, he was giving him hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to turn around. Keanu stood there for a moment, waiting for the father's response. But the father didn't know what to say. He didn't have the words to explain what he was feeling. "I'm not sure why you're doing this," the father whispered, glancing up at Keanu. "But thank you. You've saved my child's life today." Keanu gave a slight nod, his expression softening. "I don't think anyone should be without help when they need it the most." He paused, looking at the father. "And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one act of kindness." As the words settled in the air, the father could only nod. He didn't have the words, but he felt it. Keanu had seen him, not just as a man in need, but as a person worth helping. As the words settled in the air, the father could only nod. He didn't have the words, but he felt it. Keanu had seen him, not just as a man in need, but as a person worth helping. There was something about the way Keanu spoke, the way he stood there, as if time had slowed down and the noise of the world outside had disappeared. It felt like a dream, but it was real. Keanu didn't push for more words. He didn't seem to expect gratitude. He simply waited, his gaze calm, yet piercing. The father shifted uncomfortably, trying to find something to say, something that could match the feeling he had deep inside. But his mind was blank. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Keanu spoke again. "I know it's hard to ask for help. It's hard to accept it when you don't feel you deserve it," Keanu said, his voice steady. The father looked up, surprised. How did Keanu know that? How did he know exactly what he had been feeling? Keanu continued, "But sometimes, that's exactly when we need help the most. When we think we've reached the end of our rope, when we think there's nothing left to give, that's when we find out what we're made of." The father swallowed hard. He had spent so many sleepless nights wondering how he could pull through, how he could make things right for his child. He hadn't wanted to ask for help. It felt like failure. But here he was, standing in front of Keanu, a stranger who had shown him more kindness than he ever imagined. "Thank you," the father whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know how to repay you." Keanu smiled gently. "Repaying me isn't necessary. Life isn't always about payback. It's about learning how to move forward. It's about being able to look at the people you love and know that you're doing your best for them. And sometimes that means accepting that you need a little help along the way." The father's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of Keanu's words. It was as if Keanu was teaching him something he hadn't even realized he needed to learn. In the midst of all his struggles, he had been so focused on the idea of doing it all himself that he had never stopped to think about the power of accepting kindness. Keanu took a small step closer, his gaze soft but firm. "I've been where you are. I've had to fight for the people I love. And sometimes you just need someone to remind you that you're not alone." The father blinked, his mind racing. He had seen Keanu on the screen, in movies and interviews, but never like this. Never with this depth of understanding. There was no glitz or glamour here. There was only a man who had lived through challenges and who was now offering a piece of his strength to someone in need. "I know you're doing everything you can, but don't be afraid to reach out. There's no shame in it," Keanu added. The father felt something shift inside him. The shame, the guilt, the constant pressure, it all started to loosen, just a little. Maybe it wasn't such a terrible thing to lean on others. Maybe, just maybe, That was how things could change for the better. "Can I tell you something?" the father asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Keanu nodded, inviting him to share. "I don't know what I would have done without this medicine," the father said, his voice trembling. "I've already watched my son get so sick. He's barely hanging on. Every day feels like a battle, and I..." He stopped, his throat tightening as tears welled up in his eyes. Keanu's face softened as he listened. "I can only imagine how tough that must be. But you've already shown your son how strong you are. You've shown him what love looks like. That's more powerful than anything." The father wiped his eyes, feeling a wave of emotion. It wasn't just the medicine that he needed. It was the reassurance that he wasn't failing, that he wasn't alone in this fight. Keanu's words had given him more than hope. They had given him a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. What if I can't fix everything?" the father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu smiled again, a quiet, knowing smile. "You don't have to fix everything. Just keep going, that's all, one step at a time." The father nodded slowly. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but at that moment, he felt a small spark of something more than just the exhaustion that had been weighing him down. Maybe Keanu was right. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything. Maybe it was about being there for his son, about showing up no matter how hard it got. "Thank you," the father said again, this time with more conviction. Keanu simply nodded. "You've got this." The father stood there, the weight of Keanu's words still lingering in his chest. His mind was clearer now, though it still felt like the world outside was a blur. His focus was solely on Keanu, on the stranger who had stepped in when everything seemed lost. But as Keanu turned to leave, the father felt something else stir within him. "Number, he can't just leave now. I can't let him walk away without doing something more." "Wait!" the father called out, his voice hoarse. Keanu paused at the door and turned to face him. "Yes?" The father stepped forward, the words escaping him before he could think. "I don't know how to thank you enough. Keanu held up a hand, cutting him off with a gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me. It's just the right thing to do." The father shook his head. "But you've done more than help. You've changed something inside me." His eyes welled up again and he wiped them quickly, embarrassed. Keanu's gaze softened. "That's all anyone can do, really. Just give a little, and sometimes it comes back tenfold. Don't forget that." The father nodded, feeling a knot in his throat that he couldn't shake. As Keanu walked out of the pharmacy, the cashier stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been watching the whole exchange, standing in the background, her heart pounding in her chest. She had witnessed countless moments in the store before, but nothing like this. There was something about Keanu's presence, something so genuine and raw that it left her speechless. He really did that," she said softly, almost to herself. The father looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. She hadn't spoken much during the conversation, but now her words were full of awe. "He didn't just pay for the medicine," the cashier continued, her eyes filling with tears. "He gave you hope. He gave you something real." The father was quiet for a moment, reflecting on her words. He had never thought of it that way, but now, looking back, it felt true. It wasn't just about the medicine, it was about what Keanu had done for him, the way he had made him believe that things could get better. "Thank you," the father said, glancing at the cashier, "for being here, for listening." The cashier nodded, wiping her own tears away. "I'm just glad you have what you need. I'm glad you got the help you deserve." As the father left the pharmacy, the cashier stood there for a moment, her heart swelling. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. A man had walked in, not knowing if he would be able to get the medicine his child needed. But then, another man, one with the power to change the course of someone's life, had stepped in. And now, everything felt different. She looked at the empty space where Keanu had stood moments before, and a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't know where Keanu had gone or what he was thinking. But in that brief exchange, he had done something no one else had been able to do. He had made a difference. The cashier took a deep breath, the emotions of the moment still swirling inside her. She had seen people come and go from the pharmacy countless times, each carrying their own burdens. But today was different. Today she had witnessed something truly rare. A moment of pure, unspoken kindness that had turned a desperate situation into something hopeful. She glanced at the father, who was now walking out of the store with his medicine in hand. His shoulders were a little less hunched, his steps a little lighter. His face, though still tired and worn, carried a glimmer of relief. It was like a weight had been lifted from him. The cashier watched him as he exited, the bell above the door ringing softly behind him. It was as if, in that one act of generosity, everything had shifted for him. Did Keanu know just how much that moment would mean to him? She didn't know, but she felt the ripple of change in her own heart. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the way Keanu had seen the father as a person, not just someone struggling with a problem, but someone worthy of help, worthy of kindness. The cashier turned her gaze back to the counter where Keanu had paid for the medicine. The bill was settled, but something far greater had happened in that moment. She hadn't just witnessed a random act of charity. She had seen someone step into another person's life and leave it better than it had been before. How many people do that? Keanu hadn't stayed to ask for thanks, hadn't lingered for recognition. He didn't need anything in return. He had simply seen the father's struggle and decided to act. That was the kind of person Keanu was, a person who didn't wait for a reason to be kind, who didn't look for a spotlight, but who knew that every little action could make the world just a little bit better. What made him different? The cashier shook her head as if trying to rid herself of the questions that kept popping up. It wasn't about why Keanu had done it, it was about what had happened because he did. She had witnessed it, a simple moment that would forever change the father, and in some way, her as well. Could she be that person too? The question lingered in her mind. She wasn't Keanu Reeves, she didn't have the fame or the money he did, but she had something just as important, the ability to be kind, to recognize when someone needed help, and the courage to step in without expecting anything in return. She looked at the counter again where the payment had been made and smiled to herself. Maybe that's what the world needs more of, just people who step up when others need it the most. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of the father outside, walking toward his car. He had his head held a little higher now. It wasn't just the medicine that had made the difference, it was Keanu's words, his quiet encouragement, and his simple but powerful gesture. The father wasn't walking away empty-handed anymore. He had something much more valuable, a renewed sense of hope. The father opened his car door and looked at the bottle of medicine in his hands. He still couldn't quite believe it. He could feel the warmth of Keanu's kindness still radiating through him. How many times had he walked away from a situation, feeling like there was no way out? But now, for the first time in a long time, he had something that didn't come with a price tag. He had faith. Faith that things could get better. Faith that the world wasn't so harsh, that there were people out there who cared. He drove home, the bottle of medicine resting in the passenger seat beside him. His mind was filled with Keanu's words. You don't have to fix everything, just keep going, one step at a time. And he would. He would keep going, for his child, for his family, for himself. It wasn't the medicine that had saved him, it was the realization that kindness, even in the smallest forms, had the power to heal. Meanwhile, back inside the pharmacy, the cashier continued to reflect on the events. She had seen many people come and go, but she would never forget this moment. Not because it was anything extraordinary, but because it was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness had the power to change lives. She didn't need to be a celebrity to make a difference. She could do the same thing in her own way. It didn't matter if she had fame or fortune, what mattered was the way she treated others. Maybe that's what Keanu was trying to show her all along. Maybe it's all about seeing people for who they truly are and offering a hand when they need it the most. The cashier wiped her eyes, her heart full of gratitude. Keanu had given more than just money today. He had given hope, something that would last long after he had walked out of the door. The world may be full of challenges, but it was also full of opportunities to make a difference. And as she finished her shift, she made a silent promise to herself. From this day forward, she would never forget the impact that a simple act of kindness could have. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more heartwarming stories and life lessons. Share this video with someone who could use a little kindness today, and remember, every act of compassion counts. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.